All right, so for those of you who don't know, Chevalier's Books is the oldest indie bookstore in Los Angeles. We're so very proud today to be, one, hosting all of you, but most of all to be celebrating or pre-celebrating Virginia Postrel's new book, The Fabric of Civilization, coming out November 10th. Doing us the honor today of interrogating Virginia on her work is Cameron Taylor Brown. Cameron has been immersed in the world of fiber since the 70s. She was a founding board member of the Textiles Group of Los Angeles, a past president of California Fibers and Design Weavers, is currently board member of the Fowler Textile Council, and has also founded Arts Garage, a textile resource center in Los Angeles. Trust me, if we covered her whole resume, we would be here for much longer. But our main star today is Virginia Postrel. She is an award-winning journalist and independent scholar. She is the columnist for Bloomberg Opinion and has also been a columnist for The Atlantic, The Wall Street Journal, and The New York Times. In her book, The Fabric of Civilization, which she'll be talking about today, she combines groundbreaking research from archaeology, economics, and science to reveal a surprising history behind the world's most influential commodity. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over the proverbial microphone to these two experts. Please give a warm digital welcome to Cameron Taylor Brown and Virginia Postrel.
Thank you. Thank you. So thank you, Teresa. You didn't mention your name. So thank you for making all of this work. So anyway, someone has to be doing all the heavy lifting in the background. Well, Virginia and I have the pleasure of talking with one another. So I'll start by just saying I'm so excited to be able to have this conversation with Virginia, because from a selfish point of view, I love textiles, I love history, and I love to read, and Chevalier's has been my local bookstore ever since we moved to Los Angeles, 35 plus years ago. So congratulations on your longevity, Chevalier's, and thank you for hosting this. So basically, I'm excited on a ton of different levels, and I'm excited to have a conversation with you, Virginia, about your latest book, The Fabric of Civilization. So thank you so much. So I wrote up sort of a list of questions, and so I'm going to be looking down occasionally to look at them, because I am not Christian Amanpour. I am Cameron, who made my list. So anyway, so the biggest question I would have is, what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, people always ask this question, why textiles? Is the way a lot of people, to you, obviously, textiles are super fascinating, but a lot of people are like, why textiles? And I actually, in the afterword to the book, talk about the wrong answers to that question that people might expect to hear. But basically, over a period of a number of years, sometimes by complete happenstance, I heard a series of stories and facts about textile history that made me say, wow. It was everything from, I went to a conference at UCLA that was on something like Renaissance luxuries. It was sponsored by the Medieval and Renaissance Council there. And I went to hear a talk by somebody who had been the advisor to a friend of mine who's a history PhD. But then before his talk, there was a woman from the Getty who gave a talk about the enormous amounts of Brazil wood that were exported from the Spanish colonies in the New World to Europe as a cheap dye stuff in the 16th century. And the quantities were so overwhelming, I couldn't believe it. And it was just like, wow. And then later on, I heard a talk at a fashion conference, because I do write about fashion history sometimes, although I always say I'm really not interested in fashion, I'm interested in clothes. But I heard a talk at a fashion conference about how for 73 years in the late 17th and early 18th century, it was illegal to own cotton prints like this in France. That France had a prohibition that basically treated them like we treat cocaine. And I was like, how is it I never heard this wild story? So there were just a bunch of different things. There were museum shows I saw, different things that made me realize that if you look at textile history, you can learn a lot about history in general, about economic history, about the history of science, about the history of technology. And that in fact, textiles are one of the most important technologies that we have. And we like to talk about technology, and these days we all act as if technology means computers, but technology really means artifacts that allow humans to change and alter their world for survival purposes. And in fact, the word technology comes from the same root as the word textile. It comes from an Indo-European word that meant root that means to weave. So that embedded in our technology, in our texts, is the very root of the idea of textiles. And so I thought, wow, this is really interesting. And then back in 2015, I wrote an article sort of developing these themes, and that got a great response and also led me to have more contacts and delve into the world of textiles.
It sounds like the research itself could have led you down such a long path. You could have done it forever and never put it together into a book, right?
Yeah. Well, this was, yeah. So this book is about textiles all over the world. And from prehistory, the earliest thing is Neanderthal string, 50,000 years old, to the near future. I went to places like MIT and Carnegie Mellon and talked to people who are kind of on the cutting edge. And so that sounds insane. And my books are always ambitious, but this one in some ways is insanely ambitious. So how do you write that book without and have it be a book and not a library, or have it not just be the rest of your life doing this research, which you definitely could. And the way I did that was with a really tight structure. And the structure has like a warp and weft to it itself. Each chapter takes one stage in the trip from fiber to somebody owning cloth. So we have fiber, thread, cloth, dye, and then we have traders and consumers. And then there's a chapter called innovators that brings it sort of up to some of the current things that are going on. And then each chapter, in order to get the sort of chronological things, takes examples from the history of whatever that is to develop another theme. So in fiber, the theme is basically there's no such thing as natural fibers, that all of the fibers that we use that we think of as natural fibers all involved a lot of artifice to create it. And in thread, it's about how much work it takes to make thread and how that has shaped humanity and led to mechanization, and why it's not an accident that the Industrial Revolution started with thread, that was actually really important. And that's why we don't spend all of our time spinning. Spinning is a hobby now. Anyway, so
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go on.
No, I was just going to say that particular chapter connected textiles and time, and just how incredibly time consuming the making of cloth still is, but used to be way more when it was all a hand process. That was just, I sort of knew that because I've read books by others that kind of went in that direction a bit, but you just laid it out so beautifully. It was great. So
yeah, it really is amazing the amount of time. Well, first of all, it's amazing how much thread there is in anything. So I've been making videos to go with the book, and one that I haven't released yet is about bandanas. So this isn't actually in the book, but it picks up on some of those themes in the class. So a typical bandana is 22 inches square. and has 100 threads, warp threads, and 100 weft threads in each square inch. So when you do the math, that comes out to about 1.5 miles of thread in a bandana, which is small. I mean, you know, it's not a bed sheet. It's not, it's not your curtains. It's not something big. And it would have taken, at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, an Indian spinner who were the best and the fastest in the world at that time. It would have taken them more than 24 hours of work to spin that much thread. And that's before you weave it, that's before you dye it. That doesn't include the time to clean the cotton or gin it or any of the preparation before you start spinning. So cloth, which we take for granted, and it's tremendously abundant through most of human history, was really precious. And even the thread that, you know, a beginning weaver like me tends to waste a lot of thread, you know, that would have been inconceivable because it would have been so precious.
Right. So one of the, I'm going to sort of loop back to an earlier comment that you made and just talk about textiles and culture and just their long history. And one of the things that we have been talking with each other about is Elizabeth Barber, who was the first author that I ran across who examined textiles as being fundamental to the shaping of human culture. So from my point of view, and perhaps from yours also, she laid the foundation for what I would call an archaeological approach to textile history. And so I have some of her books to share, and I think just so that people know that Virginia is coming from a long line of wonderful books, and I think maybe standing on their shoulders and then taking it to the next level. So I just wanted to do a shout out for Dr. Elizabeth Barber. She wrote, let's see, I'm going to start with Prehistoric Textiles, because that I think was her first book.
Yeah, that's her academic book. Yeah,
that's more academic.
Although readable, it's readable, but it's an academic book.
But it read more like a doctoral thesis. So it was heavy sledding, I will say. And then women's work, the first 20,000 years, was a bit more of a popular read that was based on prehistoric textiles. And since she's written this, 20,000 has become more like 35,000 because they keep finding earlier and earlier evidence of textiles. And then this other one that is wonderful, it's called The Mummies of Urumqi. And those are the 3 books that I have by her, but they were maybe what, like 20 years ago at this point? They were a while ago.
Women's work came out in the mid 90s. I think Prehistoric Textiles came out earlier, like 91 or something like that. I'd have to look at it. But yeah, I first read women's work when I was working on my first book, which came out in 98. So that brackets it a little bit.
Good. So my question, I'm sorry, my lead up, the long intro to the question is, how is your book influenced by Barber? Sort of number one, and then number 2 is, how is it different? Because I think there's some similarities, but there's differences as well. So. Well,
I've already hinted at, or not in this context, but said one of the things that's different, which is that her book is about the ancient world. It's about archaeological finds, and it's really about the Middle East. Somebody needs to mute themselves. It's really about the sort of Middle East and Aegean and, you know, what we think of as classical Western, the roots of Western culture, if you will. Whereas my book, it spans a much greater time period and also includes, you know, there's a lot about China, there's stuff about India, there's stuff in Africa. It's more global. So those 2 things are different. And then, of course, as you sort of mentioned, there's been a lot of work since she wrote that book. So I first read the book, women's work. I actually first read both books when I was working on my first book, The Future and Its
meaning women's work and prehistoric textiles?
Prehistoric. Actually, I think I read all three of them.
Okay.
But I read them when I was working on my first book, which is called The Future and Its Enemies, which is very much about sort of, I mean, it has a political frame at the beginning, which has held up remarkably well, but we won't go into that. But a lot of it is sort of about how does progress happen? What does that mean? What are the forms of it? And I was very taken in her work about these sort of early forms of technology and also early forms. And then it came up in my second book, The Substance of Style. I actually used this again, this idea of people who were, very ancient people and by our standards, very poor, but embellishing things using seeds and beads and things to embellish textiles, and textiles being more than just a survival technology, also being something that provided pleasure and meaning. And those are kind of big themes in The Substance of Style. So I had been influenced by her book in my earlier work, and it was always in the back of my mind that there was this textile archaeology out there. Now, what I learned when I was researching The Fabric of Civilization is there were earlier textile archaeologists. And in fact, Elizabeth Barber, she goes by Betchen, and she's local. She isn't actually herself an archaeologist. She's a linguist, but she got interested she was reading the archaeological literature, and she kept noticing these passing mentions of textiles. And so she said, I had a chance to talk to her. And so she said, well, she thought she would take like 9 months and kind of do a survey of what was in the literature about textiles. And it turned into this, multi-decades pursuit and led to a lot of other people. But since the 90s, there's been a real blossoming of textile archaeology. And within archaeology, people have gotten much more appreciative of things like, when you find an artifact that has an imprint left by a textile, because there used to be a textile now, and now there have been like mineral deposits where the weave was. Don't clean it off, for God's sake. That's actually valuable information. Right. And so there is a whole generation, or actually by now a couple of generations of textile archaeologists, specialists who are doing that. And I can send a shout out if people are interested in textile archaeology. Our guild is actually having one of these people speak on Halloween on the 31st. If people are interested, they can get in contact with us. But my work
is, do you want to?
Oh, yes, schg.org. Go to schg.org and you can see about that, and it'll tell you what to do, which is basically email me for the Zoom link.
Okay. And actually, this is a wonderful segue into my next question. You'd think that we had queued this up, is clearly something about weaving spoke to you. I don't think you, well, first let me back up. It sounds like you had an interest in textiles, but didn't know a great deal about how they were made before you wrote this.
Yeah, book? So I'd say that would be true, but one of the things that I learned in researching the book and in having sort of conversations with very smart, well-educated people is people really don't know anything about how textiles are made now. So I knew certain basic things, like I knew what warp and weft were, and I knew what a selvage was. And I knew, some of these things that I thought were just sort of general cultural literacy, which turn out not to be at all. And one thing that the book is not written for people who know anything about textiles. It tries to, other than, they have cloth in their house, but it's written for people who don't know the difference between weaving and knitting, who don't know about different fibers. It's written for people who are interested in history and culture and economics and science. And by the way, you can learn a lot about textiles. So I did know more than the average person, the average contemporary American, I guess, because I did sew as a kid and, I had little looms.
Yeah, Yeah, you would
I
handle.
mean, I had I handled fabric, and I had a mini, basically a tiny, what's called a rigid heddle loom when I was a kid, although I only wove one thing because I could never figure out how to get it off. So, um, yeah, but I had some experience, but really I learned a lot when I was researching the book. One of the first things I did was I went to this sort of textile boot camp at the Textile Research Center in Leiden in the Netherlands, because they this is designed essentially with the idea of, like, let's say you are a curator in a museum and you're in a department that isn't the textile department, but that sometimes interacts with textiles. Maybe it's ethnographic stuff or something, and you need to learn something basic about textiles. You can go to this. And so I started with that, and we did a little spinning, we did a little weaving, we learned how to analyze, learn the difference between S-spun and Z-spun thread, and how to analyze fabrics and stuff. It wasn't all useful to me, but it was kind of a good dive in. So yeah, I've learned a lot, both about sort of traditional means and also about industrial, industrial textiles.
Right. So clearly, in all of this, I love the term textile boot camp. That's awesome. So in textile boot camp, clearly something about, and in your research, clearly something about weaving in particular spoke to you, because now not only are you a weaver, but you're program chair of our weaving guild. So hello. So what about weaving in particular spoke to you and continues to speak to you? Because you're totally dedicated to weaving now.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm a much better program chair than I am a weaver. I'm not a good weaver, and that goes back to how I learned to weave in the first place. So I'm working on the book, and I've gone to the textile boot camp, and I've done these various things, and I realized I'm very spatially challenged. I'm never going to understand looms, which are rather important to understanding the history of textiles, unless I learn to weave. So I looked online and I found the SCHG website, and there's a list of teachers, including you, but I found somebody who lived near my house, and I took a few lessons from Trudy Sonia, and I really liked it. And it did challenge me because I am not good at thinking in 3 dimensions, and the idea of translating between 3 dimensions and 2 dimensions, and then even 1 dimension, if you think about the thread, is very challenging. But I really love the combination of the color, the use of color with the patterning, and the sort of open-ended, the idea of almost infinite permutations that you can do with weaving. So it sort of appeals to my more abstract intellectual side. And in fact, that chapter, I mean, there are many reasons to weave and many different kinds of weavers, but the chapter in my book is very much about mathematics and code, and the ways we learn sort of in the history of science and technology, learning how to translate things that are very tangible, like weaving, into abstractions that you can write down a weaving draft and teach without knowing the other person. You can transmit that knowledge, which is a really important thing in the history of knowledge.
It's a notation system.
It's a notation system. Yeah, it's just like writing or musical scores or all these things. And these things are themselves technologies that are really important too. So part of, going back to the why textiles question, part of it is I'm really interested in calling attention to things that are super important that we tend to take for granted. Mm-hmm. And this allows me to do that with textiles, but it also allows me to do it with lots of other things, like notation systems.
Right, which I find fascinating. So yeah. Anyway, so another thing that I noticed, and when I read your book, I was able, fortunately, to do what do you call it? A pre-edition? What do you call that?
I would call it being my friendly proofreader
Okay, whatever.
giving
I got
me
this
advice.
wonderful, I got a
I
great
mean, there,
right. So
yeah. So it was I mean, it wasn't really exactly the galleys. It was almost like pre-galleys, but
okay.
yeah, you were very helpful, actually.
Yeah. But it was really fun for me to jump into it. It was sort of relatively unformatted and just I could.
Yeah, it was when I was it was what they gave me to proofread after it had been typeset.
Okay.
And then I enlisted a few friends, including you, who
And that
who
was
had
really
read it 50 million times.
right. It was a fun experience, and I kept going back and forth between having to read things very carefully for possible, I don't want to call them mistakes, but things that might be better explaining or terminology or whatever, but I kept getting sucked in to the narrative arc, as they say. So I'd have to sort of go back with but what I love about it, and up to what I found out about your writing practice, is that a big part of your writing practice is writing about economics and business. And I think you mentioned, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Bloomberg Opinion. So when I read The Fabric of Civilization, when I wasn't going out there with my Sharpie and got involved in what you were actually telling me, I was really struck by how often you approached textile history through a lens of economics and business. I thought that was a really fascinating way to look at textiles. And so I was hoping you could share a couple of examples where you've done that in the book, like a couple.
Yeah, there are a couple of things. And yes, this is very much, it's part of my mental infrastructure. I tend to look look at economics, look at things through the lens of economics. I had a lot of training in college, and my husband has a PhD in economics. And when I was writing for the New York Times, I was writing an economics column. So, yeah. So there are two ways that it comes out. One is that in chapters that are about other things, I look at the lens of economics. So, for example, we talked about thread and how much time it took to to spin all this thread. And one of the great things that feminist scholars have done is to point out, to look at women's work and all of this people spinning thread. But they sometimes make a mistake, and I actually call one out on it by saying, oh, these women, they make terrible wages, which is true. They're very poorly paid per hour for all this spinning. They made these terrible wages, and that's because women's work isn't taken seriously. Well, we can argue about whether globally there's some truth in that, but in the specific case of spinning, no, that is not the problem. In fact, a spinning woman was used as the iconographic representation of industry as a virtue in general, not just for women. The problem was that it took so long to make enough thread to do anything with that unless you were making silk thread, and I talk about some examples of silk thread, it couldn't be very expensive, or the cloth would have been so expensive that nobody could afford it. So there was only when mechanization was developed that it allowed much more thread to be spun that spinning wages could be raised. Now, there's an element of truth to the feminist argument, which was, why were women spinners? Because they couldn't do, they couldn't get other jobs in, depending on the guild structures, they may not have had as many options as men, and so there was some patriarchy going on there. But it wasn't the reason that spinning wasn't valuable or wasn't valued, was that it just took too long. It was a matter of productivity. And that's a very economics approach to analyzing it. The other thing is that there's actually a chapter. So a lot of people who would, if they would write this book, which I can't imagine anybody else would do it because it's insane, but they would stop once you had the cloth. Whereas I say, well, wait a minute. You've got people who trade in the cloth, and so there's the chapter on traders, and you've got the end consumer, because unless somebody uses the cloth, all of this effort that goes into it, there's no point. So both the idea that the end consumer is the point of all of this effort, that's a very economics approach. And then the chapter on traders is very much about business and institutions and the way businesses and the need for doing business, and especially doing business with strangers, leads to developing everything from accounting to mail service to all sorts of different institutions, financial instruments. Yeah.
I just that whole angle I just thought was so fascinating, and it connects dots that I wouldn't necessarily have put together. So yeah.
Thank you.
So we're going to segue, I think, we're going to amble towards the question and answer, I think. But is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we move on to Q&A? And I know, in addition to where can people find you online? So maybe I'll start with that. Where can people find you online, Virginia?
Okay, so the best place to find me online, or because you can go from there to other places, is my website, which is vpostrel.com. So if you're looking at my little thing on Zoom, it shows my name. We'll just take the first initial and the last name, .com. I'm on Instagram at vpostrel. I'm on Twitter at vpostrel. I'm on Facebook. I think it's Virginia Postrel Author.
So Google your name will find you. Right?
Yes. Okay, I'm in many places. If you want to see some of the videos that I'm making, I'm releasing them little by little about the book. I have a YouTube channel and also a Vimeo channel.
Okay. Great.
Where you can also see some of our guild videos.
Exactly. Yes. You have many hats that you yeah. Yeah. So is there anything else you'd like to share with us before we move on to Q&A?
Well, I said we should share the cover for one thing.
Share the cover. Yes.
So there's the cover. That is, you're seeing some other things there too, because it doesn't take up the whole screen, but yeah, there's the cover. So the folks at Basic Books did a lovely job.
They did.
And
when is this due to come out again? Can you remind me?
And the release date is November 10th.
Okay.
So that's basically 6 weeks from now. Or if you want a different reference, it's it's a week after the election.
All right.
You can think about, there's a great,
Virginia.
I know there's a great value in this deep history. It is very long spans of time, kind of puts a lot of things in perspective.
Right. In other words, we'll get through this too, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Okay, great. So the other thing I would like to mention is that Chevalier's is taking pre-orders.
Yes.
And also you had said that you would sign all of those. As our local store, Virginia is going to drive to Chevalier's, sign all those books, and so that you can get a signed copy from Chevalier.
Yeah. And if you're not, so if you're local, then you'll be able to pick them up at Chevalier's, but they also have a way where they'll mail them out, and all that information is on their website.
So I want to do a shout out for support the oldest independent bookstore in Los Angeles. Woo-woo! Before we, right, okay.
Okay, excellent. Sorry.
All right, so I'm handing over the torch and going on mute.
Sure. Okay, so we're entering into the Q&A portion of our discussion today. There are two ways that you can ask a question. The first way is you could just drop them in the chat box and we'll share them with Virginia. And then the second way is, if you look at the bottom of the screen, you should be able to raise your hand, in which case I'll see that and I'll unmute you so you can ask your question yourself. All right, let's get started. It does look like we have a couple questions already in the chat box. The first one is from Ari Lee, and their question is, how has what you learned from writing this book changed your own perspective or relationship to textiles?
Yes. So, hi, Ari. She's in our guild. She's a great weaver and artist also. Yeah, well, like anything, when you start to pay a lot more attention to the textiles around you. And I think in terms of my behavior, it has led to me acquiring a few pieces of textile art, as well as lots of what I would call show and tell, which is like this behind me, which is from India. I've become much more appreciative. I mean, this was the idea that drove the book in general, but much more appreciative both of how many textiles we are surrounded by all the time. Because it's not just our clothes or even our clothes and our bed sheets. It's duct tape. It's it's bandages. It's of course nowadays face masks. But if you look around you and you think about through the lens of textiles, you realize that they are everywhere, and we don't really think about where they come from very much. So that's, I think I've become much more conscious of that myself, and much more aware. I mean, I had no idea of the, for example, number of different ways that looms could be constructed. Everything from just a few sticks and a backstrap loom or held by the feet to these very, very complex, I mean, even pre-industrial. And of course, nowadays they're computer driven and they're, very, very fast, that sort of thing.
So we have another question. This one is very relevant to today. It's from Livy. She asks, the pandemic has made it difficult to get certain textiles and notions. Is there a historical aspect about shortages in the book? Any thoughts?
That's a really interesting question. I don't discuss times of shortages in the book, but of course there have been notable times. One, of course, that's the most recent would be during World War II, where a lot of times people had to make do and mend, as it said, and figure out how to do things without just being able to go to the store and get things. There was also during the American Civil War, there was what was known as the cotton famine in England. It was known that in England because they bought cotton from the American South, but they couldn't get it during the Civil War, and neither did they really want to get it because they were anti-slavery. So that was an issue there. One of the things that you find in textile history and in recent history is often a substitute of different fibers for each other when one thing becomes shortage or when something is subject to a high tariff. I remember, this is just a bizarre memory, but back in the 80s, suddenly if you were to go to buy a cotton sweater, it would be called cotton ramie, R-A-M-I-E. And I asked my sister-in-law, who was a buyer in the apparel industry, what's going on? What is this ramie? And it had to do, ramie is is a bast fiber, that is, it comes from the inside of the stem of a plant, like flax or linen or hemp. And she said, well, it had to do with the way the tariffs were at that point, and so they were mixing it with cotton to get a more affordable fabric. But in terms of notions, yeah, that's definitely people have, the search for elastic has been a big story there in terms of the mask making, and people have gotten really creative with using things like hair elastics and such.
All right, and then this is a question from Naomi Ben Shahar. They asked, any thoughts about textile and women's activities, not from an economic perspective, I assume from maybe more social perspective?
Yeah, well, it's a really important part of women's social identities traditionally. Now, what is interesting is spinning everywhere, all over the world, has basically been women's work, and nobody really knows why that is. I mean, there are plenty of theories. You can multitask. It's compatible with doing while you're taking care of kids or flocks or whatever. But weaving, in some cultures, it's women's work. In some cultures, it's men's work. In some cultures, it's both. And in some cultures, women use one kind of loom and men use another kind of loom. So that's a really interesting, culturally bound kind of thing. And the same thing with sewing. But it is definitely an area that is female dominated. Now, one of the things that's distinctive about my book is I treat it as a human activity, and I talk about men and women as well. But when you go to, say, a textile archaeology conference, and these are people who are, talking about using strontium 91 in the soil to maps to analyze where these fibers come from. I mean, it's very scientific and high tech, and it's a STEM field for sure, but it will be like 95% female. And that is, there is something that draws women into being interested in exploring questions around textiles. And I think that has to do with the fact that they have always played a really big role in women's lives. They have sometimes played a really big role in men's lives. And in some cases, there's been, it's been a family activity with division of labor. I mean, one of the things that I write about in the book are these really ancient cuneiform letters. They're 4,000 years old that record long distance trade between a city called Assur and a city called Kanesh. And one of the things, and it is in the economics chapter, but one of the letters that I talk about is this woman who is back in the hometown of Assur, and she weaves and supervises weaving these cloths that are very valuable trade goods. And she's writing to her husband, and it's like, why do you make up your mind? Sometimes you say there's too much, it's too dense, and sometimes you say it's not dense enough. And, why do you keep saying, I'm not sending you good cloth? This is really good cloth. And so you get this kind of, it's about economics, it's about trade, it's about production of cloth, but it's also about the dynamics in this marriage, which is really charming.
All right, and so this is a very, I expect to be a difficult question to answer, but it's from Sheila. She asked, will the textile industry ever return to the US, do you think?
Well, it may, but there are reasons to think that it may, but if it does, it will be very different from what it was before. And I don't write about this in the book, but it is something I have written about in articles and have definitely researched. There is an onshoring movement in both textiles and cut and sew, but it is driven by the idea of making small quantities close to the final consumer. And it's very automated, very computerized, even robot sewing. So you're not talking about large numbers of jobs. You're talking about an American, the possibility of an American industry. But that's generally true of America. I mean, there's lots of manufacturing in the United States. There's just not lots of manufacturing jobs because it tends to be highly mechanized, highly, one of the examples I love is like all of the M&Ms are made by like 4 people on a shift, 3 shifts a day, like 12 people make like billions and billions of M&Ms. I know that has nothing to do with textiles, but it does have to do with how we think about manufacturing.
Awesome. There's another question from Ari, which I think would be a great question to lead us out, which is, there must have been many stories you could not include in the book because of length restrictions. Could you share your favorites among those that did not make it?
Oh, that's a tough one. Well, my favorite may be one that I actually wrote, and it literally was on the cutting room floor. Like I wrote the whole thing and then it was like, this doesn't fit into themes of the chapter, which goes to that structural thing. So, and it's about how in dyeing, in pre-industrial dye, it's really important to have mordants, which are substances that make the dye adhere to the cloth. It depends on what you're dyeing with, but certainly for all the red dyes, it was really, really important. And from ancient times, one of the most important mordants has been alum. And so I have this story about how the Pope tried in the, I'm going to get this wrong, I think it was in the 1400s maybe, the Papal States had this source of alum, and they tried to monopolize it. They tried to create a monopoly that said, like, everybody in Christendom, you can only buy from us, because the alternative sources were controlled by the Turks, so the evil Muslims, and basically it didn't work. They kept trying and trying and trying, and they would say you're going to be excommunicated, and then they used various secular powers as well, because people really cheat. And I guess that's of the stories that didn't get into the book, that is one of my favorites, although some of my really favorite stories mostly got into the book. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. There's always that famous saying in writing that you have to kill your darlings, and
oh yeah,
I always remember that. So okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We had a really wonderful turnout and a really wonderful discussion. Of course, a humongous thank you to Virginia Postrel and Cameron Taylor Brown for whisking us away into the fabulous world of fabric. Again, I want to mention, if you'd like to pre-order a signed copy of The Fabric of Civilization for November 10th, I'm going to post a link again into the chat box. If you miss it, you can always go to our website, chevalesbooks.com. You can find the link to pre-order a signed copy there as well. All right. Okay, Virginia and Cameron, is there any closing words before we sign off
Well,
today?
I just would like to thank Leslie Roberts and Textile Arts LA for helping to put this together, although it was really Cameron and you who did the heavy lifting. Thank
Cameron,
you.
any last words, or should we sign off? Okay, awesome. Well,
She's
thank you
muted.
again. If you happen to
unmute, there we go. So I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, for coming, and it was really interesting, just the whole process of putting this together. And I'm so happy that Chevaliers was able to host. And thank you also to Leslie Roberts for putting it on the calendar. And I just had a wonderful time. I don't need much of an excuse to read a good book. So, so thank you for providing that too. And I can't wait for my copy to come. So
for sure. And if anyone did come in a little later to the event, don't worry, we will upload it to our YouTube channel, and then that will be posted as well, and you could watch it in full later on tomorrow. All right, everyone, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Teresa.